Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Bible Feed podcast. This time we are doing another overview of a biblical book. And as in previous episodes, our aim is to try to fit it into the overall biblical story. Have a look at the structure, identify some of the key themes, and maybe dive a bit deeper into one or two of those. This time we are looking at the book of Joshua. We're really going to try and get a hold of what the writers were trying to communicate to us. I'm Josh. And obviously, it's an important episode for me, thinking about my name. But Dan is here, and he is going to introduce this book to us, give us the overview, and help us understand it. Dan, how's it going?
Very good, thanks, Josh. Yeah, it's good to be talking about this book with you. It's probably not an easy one to do.
Sure.
There's lots of different types of books in the Bible, aren't there? From the Old Testament to the New Testament. Here's a book of, a lot of action, which might seem on the surface an easier one to read, easier one to pick through and work out what's going on, but probably you come away with a lot of questions. Hopefully what we can do, we can navigate that, look at some context and approach it as a Christian with a conviction in the character of God as revealed in the person of Jesus.
Excellent. So yes, a book of action and narrative, not a lot of sort of imagery and poetry and stuff like that, but still things for us to grapple with, to try and understand and to think carefully about. So paint us a kind of an introductory picture where we're sort of flying at 30,000 feet. Where is the book of Joshua in the Bible, and where does it fit broadly into the sort of biblical story as a whole?
So this is a nice, easy question to start with. So this is the next book after the Pentateuch, or the first 5 books, or sometimes the books of Moses, the Torah. The Jewish name is the Torah, with that first book straight after. And that's where it comes in the storyline. So we've got to try and paint the picture of the first 5 books very quickly. We have stories of creation and of Abraham being selected and called out, and then his family grow to the point where they end up in Egypt, and then they brought out of Egypt. There's the plagues and everything like that through the Exodus. They end up wandering through the wilderness for a very long time, and they're led by Moses, and they get to the edge of the promised land, the edge of the land of Canaan. And that's where we pick up at the end of Deuteronomy when Moses dies, and Joshua is the appointed leader to succeed him. And here he is with the people of Israel on the edge of this land. And so this book is all about them making that next step. This is a major moment in the history of Israel. The people of Israel, they enter this land that's been promised to them from the promises to Abraham and so on.
Okay, so the people have got a new leader in Joshua, and they're about to enter a new land. So we've got a lot of new stuff awaiting us. Thinking then about the kind of historical context, is there anything else that would be helpful for a reader to know kind of before they sit down and start reading the book of Joshua?
Yeah, so we're starting to talk about sort of real places, aren't we? Mm-hmm. As in with Egypt, we've referenced already. So Egypt from Exodus and onwards, and then the wilderness of Sinai, they've been wandering through these real places. And then now they're on this edge of this land, and they cross the River Jordan. So again, there's another real place, a place you can go to today. So that's in the early chapters of Joshua. But then the entering of the land becomes the conquest of Canaan. So this is where it gets quite difficult, and the book has become quite controversial, actually, in different ways. We'll think a bit later on about the sort of the moral issues of the conquest of Canaan. But thinking historically, that there's a group of people now entering this land, and lots of cities are destroyed. Well, that should mean there's lots of remains, lots of layers, lots of archaeological data and things like that, and that could sort of verify the historical context. And really, when you look at it, the picture is just really quite uncertain and mixed, actually. So the data is really, really quite difficult. So one scholar, John Walton, in one of his books, A Survey of the Old Testament, he says, one would expect that archaeology had great potential for confirming the destruction of Canaanite cities and the repopulation of the land by the Israelites. These are events that excavation should be able to detect and provide details for, yet the nature of the data leaves the picture controversial and unclear. Talks a little bit more about that, but then sums up by saying, needless to say, solutions continue to evade us, but scholars continue to try to investigate the archaeology more thoroughly, as well as try to understand how historical accounts worked in the ancient world so that we can read the material in light of those ancient concepts. So there's 2 sort of things he's saying there. If we're asking, is there historical background to this? Is there things we can pinpoint from the biblical narrative, the book of Joshua, and look to the stones or the inscriptions and the record of destroyed cities and say, yeah, look, here's a parallel. And he's pointing out 2 things. One is Well, the archaeologists need to keep looking at that and researching the actual data. But the other thing is, well, how does this book work? How do the conquest narratives work? Are we reading them correctly? And so you asked about historical context and historical background. I suppose the answer is, well, let's hold on. Let's not draw any conclusions just yet, because as we go through, we might be able to think a little bit more about what this book is trying to do, what it's trying to convey, and then that might help us draw slightly more certain conclusions about the archaeological data that there is.
Right, okay. So approach with a bit of care and willingness to read around this subject and consider what it is that the book of Joshua is trying to convey to the initial readers, what we can glean as modern readers again today. So you mentioned that book. Is that a useful resource for people to maybe check out if they want to go further and think about the historical side of things?
Yeah, it's a textbook of the Old Testament, an overview, so a book by book review, and books like that are useful for giving the background to things like this.
Right. There's a bit of information about the historical background. Is there anything else that would be useful for us to sort of keep in our minds as we think about the book of Joshua?
Yeah, one of the point to sort of zoom out, I've kind of zoomed right into,
the layers in the sediments.
Of city walls.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah. And like, is there evidence of ash there to find? And
we've got to read the book. We've got to find that ash. So, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. But if we zoom right out again and just sort of think, okay, big picture, one thing that's really important to remember is around this time, and this is the interesting thing, because the date of the entering of the land is, again, depending on what scholar you read, it's either a late date or an early date, but whatever date you take, the land of Canaan at this time was essentially controlled by Egypt. Egypt was like the major player, the big power broker at the time. So later on in the biblical narrative, you get the big empires like Assyria and then Babylon, and Egypt always remains quite a big player. But at this time, Egypt is basically calling the shots. So that's something that I definitely haven't always fully appreciated, but it really helps, I think, as we read through this book, and then when we come to some difficulties and wrestle with some things, that's a really helpful thing just to remember.
Okay.
So there's a little piece of historical certainty that we can take with us.
Sure. Okay. So yes, this is written, and the events are taking place sort of under the shadow of Egypt, almost, in that they're the big kid on the block at this point of time. Okay. So if we're to zoom in a little bit, not all the way into detail of chapters and verses, but think about the sort of the structure of the book as a whole. Is there a clear defined structure? Is it just a linear sequence of events, or is there kind of a framework that we could think of?
Yeah, the story follows a linear sequence, definitely, but I think there's a very clear structure to this. It's always good when you can identify that. So the way I see this is chapter 1 effectively is this prelude. It's the opening. It's setting the scene. Moses is dead, and Joshua is the one who's commissioned. He's told to be strong and courageous, for you shall cause this people to inherit the land that I swore to their fathers to give them. Only be strong and courageous, being careful to do according to all the law that Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn from it from the right hand or to the left, that you may have good success wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do according to all that's written in it. And, we've just finished the book of the law, the book of the Torah. So this is a clear sort of link back. And here now we have this commission of Joshua setting the scene. And then that leads nicely into the next few chapters of chapter 2 to 5, which is basically sort of showing how Joshua is leading. He becomes the new Moses, actually. Okay, so a lot of things that happen here, they parallel things that happened to Moses, or happened with Moses leading the people. So maybe I'll test our listeners now for their knowledge. Check they've been listening to the rest of our podcasts on the first 5 books of the Old Testament. So one thing that Joshua does in these chapters is he sends spies. And so, one question is, when does Moses do that?
I guess it's answers on a postcard, please, for listeners at home. That's Book of Numbers, I think, right? Being sent out to go into Canaan.
Sure. Yeah, that's right. So the spies go out, don't they, under Moses? In fact, Joshua's one of them. And apart from Joshua and Caleb, bring back a bad report. So now Joshua is sending spies out, and this time they're going to actually take the land. They're going to go in. And then also that happens in this section, Joshua, with the people of Israel, crosses the Jordan. So what's that like with Moses?
Well, so you've got the crossing of the Red Sea, so passing through waters to get to the land on the other side, I guess. Then maybe a bit of an echo there that you might see.
And there's some kind of miraculous parting of the water, isn't there? But yeah, you get that power and authority that Joshua is now showing, like Moses. And then you get something a bit more peculiar. You get the covenant of circumcision. So that happens after they cross. That's in chapter 5 of Joshua. They cross the Jordan, they get to the other side, and then suddenly all the males are circumcised.
Well, you've got Moses being circumcised, and then you've got the episode where Moses is going back to Egypt, and then Gershom isn't circumcised, and so Zipporah, his wife, has to do the job in that. That's interesting, right. Sort of enigmatic.
It's a very, very peculiar incident
section.
Isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't think we covered that.
Yes, yeah,
in detail when we did Exodus.
That's definitely a bonus episode, I think, waiting to happen.
That's right.
A very interesting little example. But yes, so clearly,
I'm not quite sure what's going on there, but it's interesting how that you just suddenly get this across the Jordan River, get to the other side, and then say, okay, right, everyone, let's get circumcised. And whoa, it's very peculiar to us. Yeah, I think it's summarized actually in sort of chapter 1 of Joshua and verse 16. All the people answered Joshua, all that you have commanded we will do, and wherever you send us we will go. Just as we obeyed Moses in all things, so we will obey you. Only may the Lord your God be with you as he was with Moses. That's really explicit, isn't it? That Joshua is the new Moses now. He's the one. Like him. So chapter 1, Moses is dead, commission of Joshua, and now here's these various incidents now that are going to prove that Joshua is this new leader.
Right. So after the setup and the transition of leadership is complete, and they are able to enter the land, what happens next in the framework and in the structure?
Okay, so then you get in from chapters 6 to 12. This is basically the battles, okay? This is the action, the battles with the Canaanites. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. You then get a long section, actually, chapters 13 to 22, which the action kind of stops. And it becomes this long description of how they're carving up the land, how they're going to divide it, all the different portion, the tribes and the allotments, and where their boundary lines are and things like that. So, that's interesting and longer than we would expect if we were writing this.
We're going from the action and the thrilling escapades and the bloodshed to council and boundary line demarcation and a lot of administrative sort of detail. So yes, quite a change of gear.
And then it kind of sums up. So after that administration, you get a couple of chapters at the end, say chapters 23 and 24, which is Joshua's final words now, passing on to a new generation. And actually, I think that's probably another parallel with Moses, isn't it? It's the equivalent of Deuteronomy. We've got a couple of chapters which are a bit like that. Joshua has a few final words before he passes on.
Just to summarize then the big structure, we've got the prelude in chapter 1, sort of the introduction, then the transfer from Moses to Joshua. We kind of revisit those Exodus main themes. We have the series of detail about the battles and the conflict. We then go into dividing up of the land, and then we've got the final words and the handover to the new generation after that. Thinking about that structure then, what can we learn or could we glean from the way the book has been organised?
Yeah, some initial thoughts on this then maybe. The kind of difficult bit, the language of the conquest. And the tricky part of that is when you read things like devote the whole city to destruction and kill all that breathes within it, and that they did. They destroyed and burned with fire and killed everyone that breathed. That's the very sort of infamous part of Joshua. And Joshua almost becomes, because you can't talk about the book of Joshua without those things coming up. And we're perhaps guilty of the same thing because we're talking about it.
Sure.
But I just want to point out that actually that bit that makes you uncomfortable is actually in quite a small part of the book. The language of annihilation comes pretty much in chapters 10 to 12, a bit in chapter 6 as well because of Jericho being destroyed. But there is a small section and it's couched within this big narrative. So I think that's really important to remember, that if we ever have, like, we're reading part of scripture and you think, oh, this is really difficult, I'm not sure what to deal with this, it sounds barbaric or it sounds against our kind of morality that we understand from other parts of the Bible, etc. And if you have that kind of problem in your head, is to think about it in its wider context. So we have this little couple of chapters, or 2 or 3 chapters, that have these problems, and I think they are issues that we've got to wrestle with, but they're within a big context. So if you just take it out of context, you kind of risk misreading what the compiler of scripture, the prophet who's recording all of this, what they want us to take from it. and consequently what God wants us to take from it. So I think that's the first thing that we should take from the structure. And then I think the other thing, which is perhaps the next step in the sequence of thinking about this, is that the whole structure then becomes a little bit of a commentary on what Israel have done. They're a new generation, they're entering the land, the previous generation weren't able to do that, and they actually go in, which is great. They're doing what sort of that had been promised for them going into to sort of take this land. But there's a commentary of, if you get to the end of this book, where Joshua is doing a Moses in his last years, he's giving a bit of a speech, a bit like Deuteronomy. And in chapter 24 and verse 14, he says, "Now therefore fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your fathers served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." And so you get to the end and you think, hold on a minute, he's telling these people to put away all these gods. So it becomes quite ambivalent, doesn't it? Whether they're actually worshippers of Yahweh or not. Are the people faithful or not? Are they being portrayed as the paragons of virtue and the paragons of faithfulness to God's covenant or not? And I think that's helpful. In this whole sort of structure, you get to the end of this and you just have that question mark. And that's what I mean about thinking about the difficult sections. If you think of them in isolation, you have some terrible things that happened. But actually, in this wider structure, that's the first thing I think that might just help us put that within a wider context. That perhaps actually we've been indicated that the Israelites aren't actually all that great. They're not necessarily the perfect examples of good, faithful observance to God.
So that's really interesting, that kind of window into the reality on the ground by what's been captured there at the end of the book of Joshua, because we've already seen that pattern rather earlier on in the story, because Exodus starts off with the 10 plagues and a huge amount of momentum and the miraculous crossing of the Red Sea, and then that seems to falter and fizzle out in a way that Moses isn't able to deliver the people into the land that was promised. And so we've had to have this kind of renewal, a sort of another go at it. So Moses has been replaced by Joshua, generation has passed, and only now are we able to actually get into the land. So perhaps that also should sort of key us into thinking about what we're seeing in Joshua here in the same way. Let's think about some of the key themes that you see repeated or emphasized as we might read through. You've obviously hinted at the battles and the conflict, skirmishes, the destruction that's commanded and carried out. What else is there thematically that we can pick up on?
Yeah, there are a few themes that come out, but maybe let's just think about this destruction, the theme of destruction, just to labour it a little bit more, so that we can put that problem out in the open. So it kind of starts in Deuteronomy, actually. In the previous book, Deuteronomy 7, for example, verse 1, "When the Lord your God brings you into the land that you are entering to take possession of it, and clears away many nations before you, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations more numerous and mightier than you. And when the Lord your God gives them over to you and you defeat them, then you must devote them to complete destruction. You shall make no covenant with them and show no mercy to them." Okay, so that's pretty straightforward, isn't it? And so with that context, you get to Joshua, and they've now entered the land, and you get, for example, in chapter 6, you have them going to Jericho, and this is the famous story of them, wandering around the walls of Jericho once a day for 6 days, and then doing it 7 times on the 7th day, and so on, and then the walls fall down, and it's very, very famous, isn't it? But you get, for example, verse 21 of chapter 6, "Then they devoted all in the city to destruction, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, and donkeys, with the edge of the sword." So Deuteronomy is happening now, and you turn further on to chapter 10. There's 5 kings, and then Joshua goes round to different cities. Let's have a look, for example. Verse 34 of chapter 10, "Joshua and all Israel with him passed on from Lachish to Eglon, and they laid siege to it and fought against it. They captured it on that day and struck it with the edge of the sword, and he devoted every person in it to destruction that day, as he had done to Lachish." And then they pass on to somewhere else, and so on. And so it sounds like they're doing exactly what it said on the tin, exactly what we read in that language. So let's not shy away from that. Mm-hmm. There's this theme of destruction, of people who are opposing the people of God, I suppose. It's definitely couched in different places as a judgment on the Canaanites in some way. there's this idea devoted to destruction is kind of almost a bit religious. It is almost like a sacrifice. It's kind of a cleansing that has to happen.
So some challenging verses, and I think we've got to think about carefully and to grapple with. So that's number one. Obviously, that for an initial reader may well be the thing that stands out as a central theme. Are there any others that we could also pick up on?
I think there's another quite prominent theme that is one that we need to put alongside those destruction narratives. And this I've sort of called the Israelite failure and the Canaanite rescue. Okay. By that, what I mean is the Israelites actually, if you read those verses I've just read through before about the destruction, sounds like they just annihilated everyone. I mean, it sounds like a genocide. That's the charge that is brought against Joshua, and this is a genocide. In modern terms, it's a terrible thing, and God must be awful. That's a serious charge. But actually, you notice the Israelite failure theme, not just Israelite failing, but actually Canaanites being rescued, Canaanites displaying faith and trust in Yahweh, the God of Israel. So, for example, famously, in Jericho, not everyone in Jericho died, not everyone perished, because there was, of course, Rahab, the prostitute. So she is a Canaanite prostitute. Just think, how low could you go to have a character that would be someone who you think they would absolutely never spare or show mercy? It's a terrible situation when a woman has to turn her hand to this sort of thing to survive. It's not a light topic to sort of disregard. You'd think that she's ripe for destruction, in the words of Deuteronomy. Mm-hmm. But it turns out she's the one who looks after the spies who infiltrate Jericho and hides them and saves them.
And yes, not only did she display this faithful work to save them, but she's also recognized and rewarded for that. It doesn't go unnoticed. But as you said, yes, she and those of her household are not destroyed. The faith and the demonstration of it ends up in her and her family's salvation as well. So an interesting thing then to hold that, I suppose, in tension with the commands to utterly destroy it, remove absolutely everything.
I mean, let's just listen to her words as well before we move away from her. So she talks to these spies that come to her, and she says, "I know the Lord Yahweh has given you the land." And she says, "We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who are beyond the Jordan." And in verse 11 this is chapter 2 of Joshua, "As soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in the heavens above and on earth beneath." And she desperately wants them to make a sign and enter an agreement, a covenant to save her. And that shows the trust. I mean, this is a self-preservation thing, but this is like, I know this God is powerful, and therefore I can trust him to save me out of this situation. That's remarkable. Mm-hmm. So she becomes this sort of paradigmatic figure of that, but it doesn't just stop with her. But what happens straight after Jericho is destroyed and Rahab is saved, the people of Israel then go and try and fight another city, Ai or however you pronounce the
artificial intelligence is what they call it these days.
Exactly, AI. Yeah, it means something different these days. And they can't overcome it. Maybe there's a moral. Maybe there's something in that.
Maybe we need to.
There's a parable
to revisit
for
this.
Modern, Anyway, they can't take this city, and the reason is because the reason is given because one of the Israelites, Achan, has actually swiped some of the spoil from Jericho, which he was told not to. It was meant to all be devoted to destruction. You shouldn't be taking the Canaanite spoil and thinking, "Oh, this is great. I'll have a bit of Canaanite wealth and Canaanite clothing and things." So suddenly, contrasted with Rahab, is this Israelite who fails. And I think that's helpful, just to show that, one, Rahab, the Canaanite prostitute, who has faith and trust, and here the Israelite who doesn't actually obey or think and have trust in Yahweh. Then after that, you have another group of people now, the Gibeonites. It's a brilliant story in chapter 9 of Joshua. So all the people in the land now are getting a little bit worried because Jericho has fallen. Ai has now fallen finally, and all the rest of the cities in this area are getting a little bit worried. And the inhabitants of a city called Gibeon are really upset by this. What are they going to do? And it's a city that's actually just down the road, not far away, but they have a great cunning plan that they'll get some moldy bread, they'll dig out their old sandals and dirty clothes, and they send an envoy as if they've come on a really long journey. and they come to the camp of the Israelites and they say, "Hey guys, we've come on a very long journey. We'd like to enter a peace agreement with you, please. Don't destroy us. We know that you're on a mission, so please just sign here and you'll protect us, won't you? Thank you very much." And so they do. And of course, the Israelites find out and they're mad, they're furious that this is a city that they should be devoting to destruction. And yet the hand is stayed. Joshua stops them from doing it. And the Gibeonites, whether through duplicity or through cunning, through whatever, I don't think we're meant to cast a moral judgment on whether it was right or wrong. The story is, here are a big group now of Canaanites who absolutely know that the God of Israel is someone who can save, and they will do anything they can to turn to him. And suddenly there's a lot of people now who are left.
I suppose, yes, we've got another example. So yes, Rahab, an individual who acts in response to Israel coming over the hill and acts faithfully. And then this other group, the Gibeonites, a different method, the bait and switch or whatever it is. But again, we're seeing a bit more complexity and a bit more variety, I suppose. Okay, so this other theme of failure and success dependent on that is quite interesting. Anything else to sort of go along with that theme here in the book?
I suppose that it kind of wraps up towards the end. You've got that passage I've already referred to right at the end where Joshua basically points out that they've been serving idols all along, put away those idols from beyond the river and so on. So that just adds to that moral ambiguity of the Israelite camp. But you also get that this story towards the end where they've divided all the land up. So this is the general section where there isn't really much action. It's more just sort of boundary lines and so on. But I kind of failed to mention that there is this little bit of action towards the end of that where some of the tribes of Israel actually have an inheritance on the other side of Jordan. So in chapter 22, those people who have come to help them in their conquest, the men of war, they go back, they cross the Jordan, and they go back to their place over there. And what they do is they decide, we'll erect a little altar, we'll have a pile of stones, something to commemorate the fact that we are together, we're one nation, we're part of the Israelites.
Sort of a memorial. Yes.
Everyone, some sort of memorial, yeah, that's right. And then the people in the land proper, they look across the river one morning and they see this altar, this memorial altar, and they go, what on earth is going on? So verse 12 of chapter 22, and when the people of Israel heard of it, the whole assembly of the people of Israel gathered at Shiloh to make war against them. And perhaps this is another part of that theme, that suddenly the only thing they can do and think about is making war with them. And it's actually predicated on a false assumption, actually. They suddenly decide they want to go and clear these people out. And it turns out that it's all smoothed over and it doesn't happen. Thankfully, the dispute is kind of resolved. But we start off this book and we imagine that this new generation of Israelites, they're good. Canaanites are bad. They're terrible. And no doubt that is the case in some degree. No doubt Canaanites performing dreadful activity in their worship of various gods and so on, and perhaps even child sacrifice and all sorts. I'm sure terrible things that they were doing. But quite quickly in this book, as well as this description of destroying and devoting to destruction, actually we're very quickly introduced to Canaanites who show faith and Canaanites who show more trust than many of the Israelites who actually mess up and show failure. And I think that's really important to take this thing as a whole. Even in a book that looks like it's all about genocide, which it absolutely isn't, okay, there's a very complex teaching here going on that is trying to make you think as a reader about where God's mercy and where God's purpose is leading, and who is God prepared to receive, and who is God prepared to work with. And this book, which on the surface, and this book that often has a label of being morally abhorrent, actually, when you look at it as a whole, it's presenting something quite complex and quite interesting to advance that whole discussion.
Right. So there's that twist of lemon in there. There's a bit of nuance and complexity, and another layer that is the purpose of this writing, to get us as readers to think carefully about these examples where we see the faith of the Canaanites and the lack of faith, the lack of commitment of those of the camp of Israel. I think that is a very useful perspective, and one that would be useful as someone is reading through the book. And it helps to dampen some of the issues a little, I suppose. But we still do have some really quite challenging and difficult things to resolve when we think about that concept of the requested genocide with the archaeological issues. Can you help us try to unpick a bit of that and give us something to take with us as we encounter those passages, sections?
Yeah, sure. There's a few more things probably to say about it. Once we've noticed that theme, that kind of helps direct our attention to the literary focus. And I think that's probably the most important thing to do as we read the book. But like you say, yes, we've still got some. So here's just a few things, a few suggestions. I don't think this is a complete answer at all, but a way of accepting or living with some possible tensions, but acknowledging perhaps don't have the full picture. First thing is that actually when you read the rest of the Bible, the rest of the biblical narrative, it's really clear that not every Canaanite was wiped out. We've already mentioned Rahab and the Gibeonites, but actually when you read the next book of Judges, Judges chapters 1, 2, and 3. It's going on and on and on that they lived with the Canaanites. There's even cities that are described in Joshua as being destroyed. They're there in the early chapters of Judges, those cities again. There might be different ways of kind of understanding that. But I think that what that helps to do is it shows that this wasn't a complete destruction. That might raise this question about language, but clearly the biblical narrative is actually pointing out to us this wasn't a holistic, complete burning of the whole land, which means we probably shouldn't expect layers and layers of destruction and layers of ash in every single city across Canaan. We need to be zooming out a bit and thinking, actually, the biblical narrative doesn't drive us to that expectation. So that's the first thing. But then it does raise perhaps another question. Why have we got all this language of devoting to destruction, leaving none alive that breathe, and that sort of thing? And there's a suggestion that this is the kind of language that you would use if you're writing a military conquest narrative, that kind of thing, which is what those parts of the book of Joshua are. In that period of time, this language is used to sort of to signify a complete victory. Like, this is a domination. We've won. You can use that in sporting terms now, can't we? We annihilated them. We destroyed them.
We wiped them off the field.
On the football field. Yeah, but you didn't actually murder them all. you just scored a few more goals. Okay, so language works like that today, and it probably did work like that back then as well. That there's basically hyperbole or sort of exaggeration, not sort of needless exaggeration, not kind of propaganda or anything in a sort of pejorative way. But this is making a claim. The army of Joshua, they took control of this land. Okay, you can just look at, for example, IVP Bible Background Commentary talks about Egyptian war diaries and how that they record military campaigns in much the same way that Joshua does. Talks about the reports of pursuing, subduing, and conquering to bring about complete and utter defeat of the enemy. And scholars have looked at that and noticed those comparisons in the language. So I think that's really helpful, just to realise that the way the language is written, we might be reading it in a particular way, thinking we're reading a newspaper report about counting individual people and lives lost, when actually this is a different sort of narrative. And that does help, I think.
I think that, as you say, to see other texts written from roughly the same period employ that similar strong, brash language to describe a military conquest that takes place, and we're successful and we're victorious, but we're not then also bound to say, well, and that meant the 100% deletion of this city or these peoples, rather than we were victorious in a battle. Yeah, it helps to understand what has gone on. And as you say, if these cities are still in existence when we come to the next book, the book of Judges, and there's clearly Canaanite influence is still going on in the land, then yes, that can help us reconcile these two historical records that are aiming and trying to achieve slightly different things.
And the next thing I think just makes this a little bit easier again is when you read through the conquest narratives, it's specific cities. These are the military outposts. These are the particular points where the armies were. Actually, the big destruction, the big battles, as we talked about, they're actually a little bit defensive in nature. When you read through the people of Israel, they enter the land. But you get chapter 10, Adonai-Zedek, king of Jerusalem, he heard all of this, how the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel. And so Adonai-Zedek, king of Jerusalem, and a load of other cities say, come up to me and help me and let us strike Gibeon. So there's a bit of infighting going on between the Canaanites, and they encamp against Gibeon. And so the Gibeonites turn to Joshua and say, "Yeah, you know what? The sort of peace deal, that defensive pact that we signed.
Time to call that.
Well, we're gonna lean on it."
Yeah.
And there's a kind of almost a self-defense or coming to the rescue of others feature to these battles. I mean, it's not sort of selling the fact that war is great and destruction is okay in circumstances and stuff. I think when you get to Jesus and Revelation and the sort of pattern of non-violence and stuff, it's really, really clear.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think the language of genocide or anything like that fits at all with Joshua. Mm-hmm. So I think that's helpful. And just remember, again, we haven't come back to this, that at the time, the big power at this time controlling this land is effectively the Egyptians. So the Egyptians with puppet kind of kings in little fortresses, all these little cities, are the people that kind of report to Egypt in some kind of really loose, informal way, that they would, pay a little bit of tribute whenever the Egyptian overlords come and that kind of thing. So they're disabling these military strongholds. And it's almost like the Exodus Part 2. They've got out of Egypt, but they're now disabling the structures of this major power, this power that has enslaved them and is a dreadful force of human evil and wickedness. So they're disabling those kind of military outposts that are kind of controlled by Egypt. So that's almost like an uprising against the oppressors narrative that you can sort of spin into this. And then, of course, we've made the point already that actually a number of Canaanites did actually make peace. Mm-hmm. Put all those things together, and then I think you have I'll never admit to having a complete and happy answer, moral issues that the conquest narratives potentially raise. But I think put all those things together, and there's a way of turning to the literary focus and seeing what this book is trying to do, which is leading us on a journey to God's acceptance of people who turn to him and trust in him.
Those layers of complexity, I think, will be very helpful as someone reads through this book, because, as you say, if they're hearing reports of what the book of Joshua is about without that detail and that background, a lot of that potentially could be lost, or it may just put the person off reading it in the first place. So thank you very much for that. That's really helpful. As we think now about what happens after the book of Joshua, obviously, as we've mentioned, it leads on to the book of Judges. But if we think about the book as a whole, how is that used in other parts of the Bible? Do we see it quoted or referred to or sort of revisited and reimagined in different parts? For one thing, the name Joshua and the name Jesus are linked, aren't they? Joshua himself is mentioned in Hebrews, where we've got a list of lots of characters who demonstrate faith and allegiance to God. What kind of connections do we see or resonances with the book of Joshua elsewhere later on in the Bible?
I mean, it's a little bit like the Exodus, this kind of amazing sort of foundation story of the nation. This is part of that foundation story. So it's big. I think the resonances flow out through to many different places. Maybe just point out a couple of things. One, to another part of the Old Testament. One of the kings later on in the story of Judah and Jerusalem is King Josiah. There's probably quite a big connection to what happens in his reign. It describes him as conducting a lot of reforms, and he kind of reopens or makes sure that the temple worship is proper of Yahweh. There's renovations in the temple. He finds the book of the law, the book of the Torah or Deuteronomy or whatever it was, and we've already seen that's there right at the start of Joshua. And he reads it and he's like distraught because, oh no, we haven't been doing what we should have been doing. And so one of the consequences of him finding this is he goes through the land himself, personally, with a crowd of people behind him, and destroys idols and altars and cuts down all these shrines of false worship and things like that. And it really does, feel like a conquest through the land, like Joshua, taking out the cultic worship places. It sounds like that. It's not a wiping out. It's not a genocide. It's not that sort of thing. I think there's some real sort of literary parallels there. And also, Josiah dies eventually, and all the people basically just bring out the gods they've hidden and go back to it straight away. And it's just like, again, at the end of Joshua, where he says, look, what are you going to do? Are you going to turn from these gods or not? There's a real kind of trying to bring reform, trying to bring worship, true worship to this people, and actually really struggling because the people end up being unfaithful in many ways. So there's just one example of an Old Testament parallel, not a direct quote, but a big parallel. But then, like you say, the book of Hebrews in the New Testament talks about Joshua. In Hebrews 4. So Hebrews 4, it just a little throwaway comment here. So it says, if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken of another day later on. He's referring to a psalm, and the writer there is trying to explain that psalm about those who will enter. And it just makes the point that Joshua didn't actually do it. Joshua didn't bring them rest. The entering into the land happened, but that wasn't the rest that God's promised. And God has later promised and talked about this rest that's got to happen. And that's a really interesting point, just a tiny little throwaway, which just makes you think, okay, when we go back to this book, we read the book of Joshua and we get to the end and we think we need to see another person like Moses. We need to see someone else who's going to bring true rest, someone who's going to fulfill the promises to Abraham. And notice the promises of Abraham include the blessing to all nations. In you and in your seed, all nations and families of the earth will be blessed, not just driven, not just annihilated. Again, this wider context of the book of Joshua and Hebrews, I think, absolutely picks up on that and says there's something greater than Joshua, someone who can bring salvation to the whole world. And of course, Hebrews is arguing that is the person of Jesus, and that's what the New Testament is all about, isn't it?
Speaking of introducing Jesus in the New Testament, right at the very beginning of the New Testament, the way Jesus is introduced is in Matthew's Gospel anyway, with a big genealogy. And one of the people who we've mentioned a number of times is Rahab, features in that genealogy. We actually get Rahab called out in Matthew chapter 1. What do you make of that?
I think it's great. Rahab, alongside a number of other women, and some of those, if not all of them, are Gentile women, like Rahab, are sort of introduced to us originally in the narrative in sort of less than perfect circumstances. Rahab the prostitute and Ruth the Moabitess. And, there's lots of situations that you could look back and think, how dare they, these women? And yet they're picked out and they're shown for having trust in God. And they're there in this line, and they didn't need to be mentioned, but they are mentioned because they're part of the story leading up to this one, Jesus, who is that Joshua, who brings that true rest and brings a blessing to the nations. And really, that's the widest context we can go now, isn't it? With the book of Joshua, we could fixate on those little chapters. And there are things that are troubling in those couple of chapters in the middle of Joshua, absolutely, and they always will be. But in this wider context that goes all the way to the whole Old Testament, to the whole New Testament, to Jesus, that's the context in which Joshua is set. And that is hopefully a really helpful way of reading this book and thinking about it as it intended.
That's really wonderful. A great invitation, I suppose, to our listeners to undertake the book of Joshua with those thoughts in mind. As we bring our episode to a close, thank you, Dan, for orienting us and preparing us and helping us to read this complex and this challenging book. We've identified some excellent themes and some motifs to look out for and consider as we read through the book of Joshua. Thank you, everyone, for listening, for joining us for another episode. Please subscribe to the Bible Feed podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if you want to see more, read through the show notes and link to other resources you might find helpful, please check out the website at biblefeed.org. Thank you very much, Dan.
Thank you, Josh.